very practical, very um, applicable to virtually every project you'll have in your career. Um, and so I encourage all of you to consider taking the class. I think we have a great time. Let me say a few things. First of all, a little bit of an introduction about me. I got my degree, my bachelor's in physics many years ago at the U of I Champaign. Then I got my master's degree at Northwestern in McCormick. My degree was in electrical engineering. MEM program didn't exist back then, as far as I know, Mark.
Well,
Uh,
I dare say that the program started in 1978. So you're either
oh,
way older than you look, or
wow. Okay, so I got my master's in '87.
okay,
So
okay.
I guess it was already there. But a little bit about my career. So I started out at AT&T Bell Labs, which has kind of morphed into Alcatel-Lucent. I was doing software development, then moved to Motorola, where I started to manage product development. Mark and I met. Mark was running the PMO at the time, and we all learned a lot together. We learned a lot from Mark. We learned a lot from each other. And Motorola, I would like to say, became one of the premier project management organizations in the country, as far as certainly as far as we believe. But a lot of work and also new product introduction. Then I moved to Zebra Technologies, a small company that makes basically we call it asset tracking, so barcoding. Uh, 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 Mostly barcode printers, scanners, et cetera, many different products that will allow companies to essentially track their assets. I ran the global operations PMO at Zebra, and we would do product lifecycle management on many different products and different aspects of operations, different aspects of supply chain. We did a lot of continuous improvement. And I want to, I want to basically pass that knowledge along to all of you because it was very good, very practical, very hands-on. And to that point, I believe in a very interactive classroom. So essentially, we're there to discuss. A lot of people will come into the class with a fair amount of industry background. We've had stories that we've shared, helped each other kind of how could that have been handled kind of thing. Um, and I also believe that you all benefit from a great amount of feedback, written feedback from me. What you'll see in industry as you write documents and you create deliverables and so on, you'll get a tremendous amount of feedback from everyone around you in written form, verbal form, et cetera. So that's very much what you can expect in the industry. And so to start to create that in the classroom is I think very important, and a lot of students have said it was very valuable. So I'd like to start with this is kind of a little special topic that one of which we talk about in the class. But I'll start with this slide, and you'll see immediately that a little bit different kind of picture here. I don't know if any of you recall, I'm sure Mark does, but the earthquake, Japan earthquake of 2011, do any of you remember that?
Fukushima.
Anybody? Very quiet.
Wasn't that the Fukushima plant?
It was the Fukushima, yeah, the nuclear plant that was affected, and but anyway, so this is an actual picture from that earthquake, from days after that earthquake, and you can see it. It was a total mess. And there was a great deal that companies learned as a result of this earthquake. Obviously, it had a big impact, but this was a presentation I put together for our uh, chief operating officer at the time, Hugh Gagne, because it took an enormous effort to basically overcome the obstacles that this earthquake created for us. So Just a little bit about the earthquake. It was the fifth most powerful earthquake in recorded history. It hit in March of 2011. You can see the damage that it created. You know, you can see in the picture and in the text, just a tremendous amount of, destruction of existing resources. And for Zebra, what it implied at the time was basically impacts to parts supply. So parts that we would buy for our printer business at the time. And I'll show in my camera this is our one of the printers that we used to manufacture. It's basically a mobile printer that's battery operated. This would be something that would hang off of people's belts. But essentially, there were parts in each of these printers that came from Japan. And so we had to fly into action. We had to figure out very quickly what's impacted, what parts are now at risk that we have to figure out. We found out that the 27 of our suppliers in Japan were impacted. And they basically said, we're going to have limited or no supply of parts for the indefinite future. And it was very challenging because as things happened, as companies learned more about their own impacts, the picture got clearer and clearer. But at first, it was, we just have no idea. We're going to have to get back to you. There were 111 different parts that were impacted from Japan. And the shortages in these parts threatened to cause lines down at Jabil, which was our printer manufacturer. They're an American company that has huge plants in China. They basically said, we've got about so many weeks of inventory of these parts, and then when that runs out, we can't make printers anymore, and so we're going to be down. Renesas, and you'll see some pictures here, they were very much impacted. They made five microprocessors for us that they said, we can't make these, and we don't know when we'll be able to make these. You can see here, I believe this was an oven. You can see their racks and their equipment that they were using to make these printers. Um, they said basically that we're going to be out for 18 weeks. Now you can think about 18 weeks to a company that's almost half of the year to be out of parts for 18 years, 18 weeks, that can kill your company. And you can see that last comment at the bottom. This was basically, these were microprocessors that were required for the main logic boards and other PCBAs on these printers. And we needed over 57,000 of those each month. And they said, sorry, we can't give you any. So quite a huge problem, as you can imagine. Um, from a Jabil standpoint, this is a picture of our Jabil lines in China. What they told us, they did a lot of assessment of, what information we gave them, and they said with no action, they would basically run out of processors in July, so they would use up their inventory. Zebra, would start to run out of printers in our distribution centers in August. The estimate of lost revenue was going to be over $60 million through the fourth quarter, and we really didn't know much about beyond then. And we were going to have a lot of additional costs because air freight, everything was going to they didn't have usable roads to ship on. So they were just struggling. And that was estimated at another 15 million plus. So this would have been a huge impact to the company, $75 million. And at the time, um, we were less than $1 billion company. And so 75 million in losses is basically 7.5% of your profit. Wall Street doesn't like a 7.5% hit to your profit. Um, so what did we do? Well, luckily, we were able to quickly assemble a project. We called it the Japan Earthquake Risk Mitigation Project. And we got teams from numerous areas, sourcing and manufacturing and engineering and you name it, to figure out, gosh, what can we do to basically, mitigate this as much as possible. And so we were able to very quickly put together many, many different actions, different solutions that could fix different parts of this situation. So, finding alternate part sources, shaping demand, which means essentially convince your customers to buy other printers instead of the ones they maybe bought most of the time, et cetera, et cetera. So we had to essentially very quickly pull together a lot of um, ideas and actions to fix this problem. In the end, by the end of 2011, this was deemed a success story. We had avoided tens of millions of dollars of cost, and customer satisfaction was, for the most part, maintained. They understood that all the companies they worked with had this issue. But I ask you, would you call it a success story? So kind of what's wrong with this picture? We were very happy with the fact that we avoided this cost, but any of you, can you tell me, what are your thoughts? Would you call this a success? Would you call it the right way to do things? Anyone?
Would it be done otherwise? I mean, it is a success, but I'm not sure if
I'm
it.
sorry, I don't. Hello? I'm sorry.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, there we go.
Yes. I mean, I would, yes, call it a success, but I'm not sure what are you implying? Would it be done in another way?
Okay, good question. So, why don't I use that as a great segue? So, the business did recover, but we still lost over $9 million of sales and essentially a hit to our profit. So, we basically lost about 2 percentage points of profit in the end after we calculated everything. So, we dodged a bullet, but we still lost a tremendous amount of money. It hurt our profits. So, not you wouldn't really want to call it a success story. And the point I was trying to get at was that all of our actions here were reactive rather than proactive. Essentially, we had to, address after the fact all the impact that this earthquake implied. So, what if instead we could have avoided these costs through more proactive action? So that's kind of the question. And what I'm going to talk about is essentially a field within product lifecycle management, within product development in general, that tries to foresee the things that might happen here. Enter a concept that's called business continuity planning. I don't know if any of you have come in contact with this in the past, but in business continuity planning, you essentially say, what is it going to take to keep running the business, to continue to make money no matter what happens to us, could be an earthquake or a fire or a cyber event or so on and so forth. But what would it take to do that? So business continuity planning and the resulting business continuity plan allows a business to anticipate and mitigate possible future impacts due to catastrophic or even some of the most commonplace events. So by doing this, the business can decide to take on additional costs. There's going to be some costs, both upfront and ongoing. But then when these kinds of things happen, the business is much better equipped to address them and essentially minimize their losses. Um, so it's essentially like an insurance policy. You say, I'm going to pay up front for some insurance to make sure that these things don't impact me. Um, so essentially, what business continuity planning does is it basically supports and guides a company's product lifecycle management to maximize the company's success, even through these challenging periods. And the way we're going to look at it here is essentially you've got a product life cycle. You've got, And I'm talking beyond just developing and launching the product, but you're in production and you're trying to make printers in our case. How do you protect that so that that can continue even after the earthquake? So essentially, what can be done to make that product life cycle more robust so that essentially it's more reliable for the company? Every larger company I worked for had some form of this already in place. So Bell Labs, Motorola, Zebra, Southern California Edison, I worked there for a while. They had every one of these companies had a business continuity plan that said we're going to do things to essentially prevent any potential impacts. Um, Southern California Edison, you can imagine they have to deal with earthquakes on a much more frequent schedule than the rest of us. So every company has a very specific business continuity plan, and let's talk through that a little bit. Um, so it all starts with risk mitigation, something that's very near and dear to uh, Professor Werwath's heart and my own. Something that is used very often in project management. And we basically say, and I hope this equation is going to be somewhat familiar to some of you. But as a first step of business continuity planning, a company would look at what are all the risks to the business and their product life cycle in case of various events occurring. And then you want to quantify what potential impact that could have. And the standard formula we used to use going way back to Motorola was that the business risk was essentially the probability of occurrence times the impact of occurrence. So maybe you had a probability that was low, an earthquake hitting or a meteor hitting you from outer space. So it might be a low probability, but the impact could be so traumatic that you say, even though it's low probability, we need to take some steps to protect ourselves. So, as a first step, you would go through in business continuity planning and look at all of these various risks and decide, what's the probability, what's that impact if it occurs. So common risks would be this list here, including things like labor shortages, political change, etc. So things you might never think about otherwise, but obviously could impact the company, as we're seeing right now with tariffs in the U.S. So that would be step one. And then once all those risks are understood, the company can analyze, what are the highest risks, compare them all to each other, decide kind of what's the priority list, and you start to determine the costs of mitigation. And so cost of mitigation might be fairly high for some of these things, um, but the company will still decide it's the cost can can outweigh or it will be outweighed by the benefits that we get from putting this into place. Um, so you look at what steps, what costs, both upfront and ongoing. So it might be something you have to do every single year, would be needed to eliminate or significantly reduce each risk. And then finally, you use that cost benefit analysis to decide which solutions do we want to put into place and which of these are we just going to accept as a risk and really not try to do anything about. So here's an example, for instance, of business risk, many of which could have been impacted by the Japan earthquake, but you could have critical part supply be impacted. So you might want to do things like consider, let's establish multiple part suppliers. So if one supplier is down, we can switch to another. Let's stockpile critical parts. IT systems could be impacted. So you say, all right, let's harden our IT systems. Let's distribute our server pool to multiple locations so that, again, if one location is impacted, the others are not. If labor is affected, maybe you decide to, create multiple sources of labor, or you decide to outsource parts of your labor model to different companies. So you would go through and risk by risk, you would determine kind of what are these steps that we would need to put in place and what do they cost? Um, so um, you then would put all these together into a business continuity plan. So typically a document that captures everything you plan to do and some of the things the aspects of that program behind it. You obviously vet them with management. You get them approved by management. They always want to see, especially when there's cost going to be involved. And then you capture that and you communicate it to employees so that everybody is aware of it. A schedule is put into place also for regular review and update. So you recognize that, this is not a static kind of plan. This needs to be reviewed, let's say, once a year to make sure that we're thinking through everything. And then the individual solutions would need to be added to your product lifecycle management policies and processes and tools. So it might require you to rethink some of the ways you do business so that you can protect yourself against these kinds of things in the future. Um, Product lifecycle management can also look at your business continuity plan and say, well, maybe some of these don't apply to us. Maybe perhaps we're working on a software only product, so we're not impacted by that hardware manufacturing piece, but we are impacted by IT and by systems going down, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to focus on those. We're going to tailor kind of the aspects of the business continuity plan to just address our particular needs. Um, so decide which applies, which doesn't apply, and then maybe target some of those solutions to specific life cycle or product vulnerabilities, whatever those might be. In the end, through this process, you should be able to avoid a lot of costs and business impacts that would otherwise bring the company to its knees. And so, any questions? This makes, I would expect it makes sense, certainly from a project management kind of standpoint. Any questions or thoughts?
I have a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. So the Zebra didn't have this mitigation plan in place for the factories in Japan?
No. So at the time that this hit us, we had, multiple sources of various parts and that kind of thing, but we were not thinking business continuity as much as we were thinking, hey, we might be able to get a better price or, get vendors to compete with each other kind of thing. But unfortunately, no. So after the earthquake, they kind of realized we've got to do a much better job in this area. And they started to put a very proactive plan into place. So,
My observation would be that, through most of the 80s and 90s and then in 2000s so far, up until maybe a few years ago, resiliency in the supply chain was not as important as cost effectiveness. So people were focused on optimizing, which in many cases made supply chains very fragile and very tenuous. They had, in many cases, vulnerabilities that were never really focused on because we were so focused on squeezing cost and time out of the supply chain. And that kind
yep,
of optimization led to some of the catastrophes that we're talking about right here.
right. Yeah, and in fact, there was an interesting interview I heard where a supply chain expert was being interviewed, and the question was, gosh, did the US have a really bad supply chain? Because when COVID came along, and especially the COVID rebound a couple of years later, everybody wanted to start buying products, and supply chain just wasn't made for that. And he was asked, did we have just a poor supply chain in place? And his answer says, no, actually, we had a tremendous supply chain, but it was optimized to Mark's point It was optimized for the business we were doing at the time. We weren't optimized for double the business that we saw after COVID. And so when that doubling in demand came along, we were completely unprepared to deal with it.
So a
Uh,
simple example would be, and I hate to use this example, especially after lunch, but toilet paper. So ironically, we ran out of toilet paper and a lot of stores were had empty shelves and a lot of people were hoarding, when in fact the overall supply of toilet paper wasn't the problem. It was the fact that the consumer packaged versions of toilet paper were in short supply, and the commercial packaged versions of toilet paper were in excess supply. Everyone had shut down their offices and worked from home. And when you're working from home, you're obviously, doing everything else at home. So um, you would think that it would be an easy shift to say, okay, I'm packaging this toilet paper for consumers instead of commercial use, but it turned out to be much more difficult than it sounds, right? And the same was true with commercial packaging of food. So certain types of food were packaged for restaurants and commercial and cafeterias, as opposed to consumer packaging. So we wound up with too much of one type of food and not enough of the others. So when you're thinking about continuity planning, I think about resiliency. How easy can you shift from one type of market to another, whether it's commercial to consumer? But I thought you were going to go in a different direction, Mark. So I'll let you finish your presentation, then I'm going to go and maybe take your thoughts in a slightly different direction.
okay. All right. Well, and so basically, if there's anything you want to say, I was going to segue into the course itself.
Well, I guess I was going to say this. You talk about Fukushima, and it was obviously clearly a disaster. So three reactors melted down. And you could ask, well, why did they melt down? It was clear. Oh, there was a tsunami, right? The tsunami was 40 meters, 120 feet high, right? Something like that. Um, but the building itself was higher than that, right? So why did they melt down? Well, the generators were overwhelmed with water, with seawater. Because of that, they couldn't pump the water for the cooling system. So the cooling system was unpowered. So effectively, it overheated from that, right? And the three reactors melted down. And that caused a tremendous environmental catastrophe, which we're still kind of dealing with today. Where were the generators? TEPCO ran Tokyo Electric Power Company. They designed the plant, right? So where were the generators located?
In the basement.
Yeah, why? To save money,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Because if they're putting, so these are diesel generators. So you need diesel tanks, right? You need generators. If you put it at a higher location, it was going to cost more money than putting it either in the basement or ground level. So to save money, they put it in the basement where it was easily inundated, okay, in this kind of scenario. So when you're going through the design process, right, it's one thing to say, let's look out for costs, but let's also look out for contingencies, right? It makes no sense. It would have been a few extra $1,000 in my mind to put it on the top of the building. They had a reactor building that was 50 meters above the base, right, 150 feet. It would have cleared, the tsunami would not have reached it, okay? And had that been at the top of the reactor building instead of in the basement, things would have been very different, right? The disaster, the catastrophe as we know it would not have happened. So it's not just, stockpiling parts and having parts available, but it's also thinking about the design of your systems and having a systems approach, right? The weak link in the system is what's going to bring your system down.
Yeah, and I think Mark, you made a great point before that, it's essentially business continuity planning. Most of the time, as Mark said, you will focus on cutting cost, making things more efficient, making things faster, and more just in time type of planning. And that's what the company typically wants because that's going to make the most profit. Business continuity planning says, well, let's set all that aside and we're going to have to trade off, that kind of thinking for the kind of thinking that says, what if the situation we have day to day is no longer the case? What if our basement is flooded with water? What if our roads are destroyed and we can't ship product, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a very different kind of thinking, and one that, as I said, the larger companies will tend to do, the smaller companies might struggle with. Um, but essentially, it's a very essential piece of the business because you can be wiped out from one of these events, very quickly. More recently, we saw COVID impact our labor supply. We saw tariffs, China tariffs impact our supply chain. Now we're seeing worldwide tariffs impacting all of our supply chains. Um, so these are very real, very current kind of problems that companies have to deal with, and it's not easy. You'd like to think that you can anticipate some of these things, but companies are becoming smarter now because they've now lived through some of these events and they've felt the pain. So,
I used to have an Oric vacuum cleaner, and I bought all my parts from the Oric store. And after Hurricane Katrina, which impacted New Orleans, I was unable to get the parts I needed for my vacuum cleaner because guess what? Uh, all of the Oric facilities were in New Orleans, frankly, in low lands, which meant they were inundated and out of commission. So companies can go out of business with a single storm.
yeah, yeah. So, tying this into PLM, what the course will look at is essentially uh, all of these kinds of activities that could be related to product lifecycle management. So just to say a few things about that. So business continuity planning is just one example of things that'll impact your product lifecycle, impact your product lifecycle management. But we cover many other topics in the PLM course, cultural impacts and management. I've seen many, many different cultures across all the companies I've worked with, and each one of them kind of provides a little bit different challenges. Continuous improvement. So you don't want your product lifecycle management to be something that's a one and done. You want it to be a living, changing, and evolving kind of thing. Requirements management and traceability is something that Mark and I have talked about many times, and can be very important, especially nowadays with PLM automation, very much dependent on requirements management and many, many more. So all of these things are topics that we'll get into in the course. So for instance, I just want to give you a brief introduction. Obviously, we'll start with life cycle models to kind of set the groundwork for the course. Typically, when you talk about life cycle models, engineering, of course, is very focused on these three parts of the life cycle: defining what your product will be, developing it, and launching it. And a lot of people in industry, a lot of people in education focus on these three life cycle phases. But the PLM course goes a little bit further and says, well, no, let's look at the complete lifetime of a product. So let's look at the production phase, which could run for many, many years. This printer that I showed you, so it took probably a year and a half to develop and launch, but then it was on the market for 10 years. And so you spend only a year and a half in these first three phases, but you end up spending more than 10 years in these other phases. And so let's not neglect those. Let's continue, let's focus on those. Let's understand, what are the opportunities in those later phases.
So Mark, you say let's not neglect them, but I mean, my experience from my memory is that phase 5, retirement, is the most neglected phase of all.
Yeah.
So if you're launching 30, 40, 50 products a year in a steady state scenario, you would think you'd be retiring a similar number. But what if I told you that the number that you retire might be 2 or 3, and
Right.
you're accumulating products that you have no intention of building anymore because they're obsolete, or you're holding them in inventory just in case somebody wants a replacement part or somebody wants a replacement device,
Right.
And those carrying costs and everything else that goes with keeping a SKU alive in your system, right, has a cost. There's an overhead to that.
Right.
Nobody looks at that overhead because, frankly, this is the unsexiest part of the process. It's the part of the process nobody really wants to deal with.
Yeah, and to Mark's point, when we were at Motorola, Motorola was notorious for virtually keeping every single product live for many, 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 many years. And so the number of SKUs would just continue to grow almost exponentially and never go away. Zebra tried to do more work in this area. They had a much more proactive retirement model that we get into in the class. But just a note here that that'll be the focus of the class, or some of the focus is we'll also look at timing and interrelationships. So for instance, there are things that you do in the define phase, such as sizing the demand for the product that you're going to build and saying, hey, I think, this printer I have, I think I can sell 100,000 in the first year. And so your factory says, okay, so they gear up for 100,000. Well, what if the demand is 20,000? Then all of a sudden they're stuck with this enormous amount of inventory, enormous amount of capacity that is essentially costing the company a lot of money. Or the opposite, that they underestimated, and instead of 100,000 being demanded, it's 1 million. And then so your factories are essentially in constant scramble mode, trying to invent, try to create more capacity. Another example is in the production phase, as Mark was pointing out in retirement, you should be continually retiring products and eliminating inventory and that kind of thing. Well, in order to be able to do that effectively, you had to anticipate retirement of a product enough in advance to say to your production lines, hey, we got to take our production down. We really should be dropped down to about 1/10 of what it used to be because we're just stockpiling too much inventory, and we plan to retire this in a year. So all we need is about a year, year and a half worth of inventory. So these are decisions that are made in phases of the life cycle that will impact you downstream, and you need to be aware of those. The other way to look at product lifecycle management is essentially as a foundation upon which you build your product lifecycle. You build all the processes that go into place to produce a product, sell it, distribute it, et cetera, et cetera. So, for instance, all of these kinds of activities, which we cover in the course, these are things that will happen throughout the life cycle. Typically there's not a lot of attention placed on these, but companies have learned that they really need to place attention on these things. And it was interesting contrasting Motorola, that was primarily involved in making the customer happy and developing the best products, versus Zebra, who said, sure, we want to do those, but we're a small company. We can't afford to lose money on inventory and so on and so forth. We can't, we would bleed to death if we tried to do those. So we've got to be smarter in these last two phases. We really have to figure out a way to squeeze more profit out of our products, and to, effectively retire them when the time comes. The other thing, as Mark mentioned earlier, Motorola introduced the concept of phase gates. There was actually a company called PRTM. They came up with their version of phase gates called the PACE process. And both Motorola and Zebra, as it turned out, had brought PRTM to teach them the PACE process. So more and more companies use a phase gate approach. It's not a panacea, but what it essentially does is say, hey, let's stop, let's pause at the end of each of these phases to make sure that the project is where we'd like it to be. We've finished all the work that we said we were going to do. We're truly prepared to move on to the next phase, and it makes sense to move on to the next phase. And so your product approval committee will give you that approval to move forward and guidance along with it. Um, so essentially, we touch on virtually all of this in the product lifecycle management course. We touched on key roles as well. So every role that you can think of, pretty much, we touch on it in one way or another during the course. Every one of these roles is critical to, you know, product development, but product continued, sales and eventual retirement and so on and so forth. Various roles will play, a smaller or a larger role in each of those different phases. The other thing that I like to think of in product lifecycle management is that it's really, in my mind, a two-pronged approach. The first prong says we have this life cycle. It's tried and true. We've used it for years. We've honed it to the point where it's very efficient. Let's apply that to our products every time, very consistently. Maybe we tailor it at its application a little bit when we apply it to our products, but we want to do that so that it's very repeatable. It's a very effective way of producing products because of our experience. But you never want to sit still. You always want to think about what can we learn from continuously applying this life cycle to products, and what kind of continuous improvement can we do? So essentially, what you do is out of that continuous improvement, you might come up with additional process improvements, additional tools and automation that might help you in product management, but also in selling the product, distributing the product, retiring the product, and so on. AI is playing a greater and greater role these days. But culture, I always return to culture because culture will impact you in ways you would never anticipate. So all of this has to be part of that continuous learning and fed back into a product lifecycle management approach. I bring in a lot of different industry experts, people I've worked with in various companies, who each know, their areas of the business, very well, very much in detail. Um, and so you'll learn from people who have been there, done that in industry, in every area. And that's it. Thank you very much. I don't know if any of you have any questions about the class or about business continuity planning. I'd be happy to answer any of those.
Hey, Mark, I put together a quick quiz, a one-question quiz for the students. I thought I could have them answer it to see what they know or maybe what they don't know about stage gates. So let me launch that.
Okay.
I don't know, hopefully people can see this. Everyone can see it okay? Yep, okay.
Yep.
We're starting to get some answers. You like the question, Mark?
Yeah.
The only reason I ask it is that we debated this quite a bit at Motorola in the early days. Why do we have this? It just seems like unnecessary overhead, process for process sake, that kind of thing. And it turned out to be very useful. And even this new company that I'm consulting with, they have a 27 gate model.
Wow.
Which when I walked in, it's just like, are you kidding me? I had a 16 gate model and they almost fired me. So I had to squeeze it down to 5 or update my resume. That was my choice. And so I squeezed it down to 5 thinking, well, I guess this will work. But 27 gates, and I think they're struggling with, why do they have it? What's the purpose, right? MEM, the the project managers don't necessarily use it as a tool. And I think once they get to using it as a tool, it'll start to make more sense. So I'll give you guys another minute or so. I guess I'd like to hear Mark's answer first to make sure I got it right.
So I'm not seeing how I would participate in the quiz.
Maybe you're not allowed because you're like a co-host.
I guess.
All right, folks, I'm gonna end the poll now. So let me push the button. I'm going to share the results. So in my mind, the answer is the last one, all the above. I don't know if Mark, you agree?
Oh yeah.
So I guess about half of you got it. I guess the other half are probably struggling with what is the purpose of stage gates. So if you want to be able to be authoritative on it and to have a sense of ownership as to what it is and how to use it, take the class.
Yeah. Yeah, we cover stage gates pretty comprehensively and essentially take a single product through all of its stage gates, take multiple products through various stage gates, and the advantages of doing so. And as Marcus said earlier, it's very much a project management kind of approach. It's basically formalizing the link between project management and the product lifecycle.
So how many product managers are on the call right now? Could you give us a thumbs up? Product managers, product management concentration. I'm counting them as they go. Let's see. It looks like we got 5, 6. Looks like about 5 or 6 total. How many project managers or project management concentration folks? All right, I'm seeing a couple. 2, 3. It's climbing, it's climbing. All right, so I guess for either one of you, product or project management, I think this is a valuable class. It's something that would go beyond the basics, right? Product management basics, project management basics. I don't cover anywhere near this kind of level of detail in the traditional project management course that I've been teaching. So I definitely would recommend taking this class if you're in either one of these concentrations.
I agree with Mark. I definitely recommend this course.
I wonder why. Okay. Any questions for Professor Weinstein while we're here?
If you do have questions after the class, there's my email address at Northwestern. You're welcome to send me email and ask any question you might have.
Okay. And you're offering it when?
Answering questions?
No, when are you offering the class?
Oh, sorry. So it'll be offered in the winter quarter. I'm not sure, Mark, which day was chosen. I haven't seen an update on that yet, but I saw something that said Friday afternoons, but I wasn't sure if that was the final decision.
It looks like Friday from 1 to 4 on
Okay.
campus. I'm not sure if that means Krebs. I'm thinking it's the Krebs classroom, but
Usually I was in Padula.
right. So for those taking entrepreneurship, that's offered Friday morning. And everything else is the remainder of the week, with accounting being on Saturday. So there's no scheduled conflict with this class and any other MEM class. So with that, thank you, Professor Weinstein. Nice job. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you, everybody.
And I want to thank everyone here. I guess while we're here together, are there any questions people have about the program, about events coming up? I know we're going to have a Thanksgiving lunch in November, later in November. Thanksgiving is technically the last week of November, so the 27th. So we're probably going to have it, I think, on the 24th or 25th. Any questions or comments? Any concerns? Otherwise, I'll just reiterate, I will, yeah, what's the question? Prachi? Yeah, go ahead.
Um, I don't know, for some reason I delayed or my application for that project that you have sent was not submitted. So I just
Are you
wanted to.
talking about the market research project?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think we've already hired the people for that project.
Okay. Okay. No
Yeah,
problem.
so I apologize if you missed out.
No
Um,
problem.
The project I'm referring to is the project at the end of the quarter for this class, which will be shown on the assignment section. Right, so what we're looking for you to do, working in your teams, everyone's got a team that they've been assigned to. And it's due November 21st, so I will share my screen. So there's no confusion here. So hopefully you guys can see this. I'm giving you two options, but if you want to come up with a third, I'm willing to entertain a third option. But basically, create a process or a routine that could benefit the MEM program in some way using AI. So make.com or some similar AI tool will help you get there. Another approach is to either do an ebook or a case study on a topic related to engineering management with an eye towards maybe getting it published. I would like to see something about AI because I think that's a very hot topic and it's going to be a lot easier to get published. I have connections with the IEEE TEMS organization. So if you want to get published in their EMR, which is the Engineering Management Review, I have some connections there. I can help you get there. So make your choice as a group. Start working on it if you haven't already. And in 2 weeks' time, I would like a 3 to 5 minute presentation from each team on what they did. And hopefully, if you have a demo or something you can share, prototype, PowerPoint deck, whatever, just keep it short because there's 6 teams and we have about 60 minutes, okay? With that, I will let you guys go. It's almost 2:30. I don't see any other questions. Thanks again, Professor Mark, and we will see everybody next in this class in 2 weeks' time. So the 21st is our next and last meeting, okay?
Thank you, Mark.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark.